Well, welcome. My name is Mary Beth Gassman, and I am a professor at Rutgers University. I also have the honor of serving as the executive director of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice at Rutgers. And we are very, very proud to annually sponsor the Distinguished Proctor Lecture Series. And this year we have someone who I admire so much, Menah Pratt, with us. I'm just thrilled to have Menah with us. For those of you who might not know her, she is Vice President for Strategic Affairs and Diversity and a professor of education at Virginia Tech. In addition to that, and one of the main reasons why I wanted to ask her to be the Proctor Lecturer this year is that she has two amazing recent books that she has contributed. One is called From Cotton Picking to College Professor: Lessons about Race, Class, and Gender in America. And the other, which I reviewed recently, is called Blackwildgirl: A Writer's Journey to Take Back Her Superpower. So Menah is going to share reflections on disrupting the status quo with us today and developing tools to elevate the experiences, perspectives, strategies, and voices of marginalized and minoritized communities. And I want to say, in addition to all that, she has an amazing bio. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading that because you can see that online. But what I do want to say is she is just a warm and wonderful person who has an amazing fighting spirit. She gives some of the best advice that I've ever heard. And I personally, as I said, reviewed Black Wild Girl recently, and it is one of the most beautiful books that I've ever read. And I read a lot of books. It's really beautiful. It's heartfelt. It's so genuine. And I think it exemplifies exactly who you are, Menah. And I'm just so honored to have you as the Proctor Lecturer this year. Um, and so I'm going to hand it over to you in just a minute, just letting our audience know that you can put all your questions for Menah in the Q&A. I hope you will ask them because her answers are incredibly powerful. And we will take those after Menah gives her talk. So Menah, take it away.
All right, thank you. I'm just honored and delighted and humbled to be here. Thank you for all the work that your team, Mary Beth and Chris Span, have put into my visit. It's been really wonderful. In Black Wild Girl, the book I just released, I begin by talking about a visit to the cemetery in Freetown, Sierra Leone, that my grandmother took me to when I visited for the first time in the 1990s. My grandmother took my mother and I to a weed-covered cemetery and walked around and introduced my mother and me to our ancestors, my ancestors, her ancestors, and had a little conversation with them. And then she poured libation. She left some food at their headstone and poured some rum. But it got me thinking about this concept of libation and honoring those who have gone before. And so in Black Wild Girl, I honor Leonida McLean and Lorraine Hansberry, two Black women who died in their 30s. And today, I want to start by just honoring and recognizing Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor. Next slide, please. For whom this lecture series is named. He had a phenomenal and impactful career as a pastor, educator, leader, and ambassador. He was known for his, quote, quiet activism, as well as being a forthright spokesperson for his condemnation of racism, militarism, and injustice. And he was often a delegate to national and international conferences focusing on human rights and peace. So I hope today to be forthright as he was in my talk. So my talk is entitled Disrupting the Status Quo My Own Way, because the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And it draws inspiration from Audre Lorde. Next slide. Audre Lorde was an American writer, professor, philosopher, an intersectional feminist, poet, and civil rights activist. She described herself as a, quote, Black lesbian mother, warrior, and poet, and I love that word, warrior. She dedicated her life and her creative talent to confronting and addressing injustices of racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia. In her essay by the same title, she writes, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." So today I want to share some strategies and realities, some tools and techniques and lessons learned from leading diversity and inclusion efforts for almost 30 years as both a scholar and an activist. I want to start with a story. Once upon a time, an institution got an NSF advanced grant, National Science Foundation grant, a grant to support the advancement of women in STEM fields. Everyone was excited. Committees were formed. Good work was done. Policies were changed, and everyone was happy and pleased with themselves. As the grant ended, one little lady was hired. They gave her a little office by herself. She created some annual reports, hosted some gatherings each semester with great speakers, and had committee meetings. She generally plugged along by herself. Nothing too transformational happened after the grant ended. Her work expanded outside of the grant to other equally important matters in faculty affairs. One day, several years later, some women, mostly faculty, were upset. "We are unhappy," they said. "Pay attention to us." So everybody stood at attention and moved into motion. They demanded to meet with the president and provost. They asked for a work group and a committee, and meetings were held and issues were raised. What about that one little lady? It wasn't her fault. She was committed, hardworking, and had done good work by herself, basically. It wasn't going to be fair to hold her accountable. But if not her, then who? The institution? So another committee was formed and more issues were raised, and the little woman retired. Her office space was reassigned and the committee dissolved. So what happened? It's not a fictional story, it's a true story. This happens all the time. And so we must and should ask, what happened? What about the NSF Advance Grant? NSF grants focus on sustainable transformation around women, often in STEM fields. NSF is an opportunity and a challenge. The money comes, it's a kickstart, and then the reality hits after the grant runs out. But the expectation is that the work continues, accelerates, elevates, because it has become embedded as part of the culture of the institution. How do these changes actually become embedded and part of the culture? How do we change the story's ending? Next slide, please. Answering this question has been the focus of my career: sustainable institutional transformation. When I started at Virginia Tech, I reviewed almost 20 years and 2,000 pages of diversity reports. And what did I learn? I learned that a small but committed contingency of faculty staff, often women and minorities, sometimes students, often the same ones, had been laboring and toiling around the work of inclusion and diversity with moderate to little success. And what success was gained, a remarkable program here and there, resulted in short-term wins and outcomes. The programs were often the result of one or two hardworking, committed individuals who put in extraordinary hours and time and shepherded almost single-handedly the recruitment of students, the retention of students, and the persistence of students. Most programs were student-related. Some success was around getting funding for speakers and programs. But when the hardworking, often man or woman of color, left, the program slowly but surely became less effective, and often ended. This was a pattern. I wondered, could this pattern be interrupted and disrupted? In order to interrupt and disrupt and replace a pattern of small, almost inconsequential, and unsustainable change with significant and substantial sustainable transformation, I needed to understand how the pattern was created and to think about what tools could be used to create a new pattern. My training as a sociologist and lawyer have provided me a set of tools to think about systems and structures in society, systems and structures that have created permanent and persistent, almost irrevocable patterns. Next slide. The issue of sustainable transformation is about praxis and the challenge of praxis and addressing people, philosophy, processes, practices, policies, perceptions, politics, power, and protocols. Physics, perhaps, can be a useful metaphor. My father was born in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and he came to America for his education. He got his bachelor's degree in the 1950s at Hampton University. And then he went to Carnegie Mellon and got his master's degree and PhD in nuclear physics in the 1960s, only to have his career sabotaged by racism 3 years into his faculty career. But that's a story for another day. But let me share what wisdom I think we can perhaps draw from physics as it relates to universities. Next slide, please. Universities are large masses with inertia. They resist change and acceleration. And the larger the university and the longer its history, the greater resistance it has to change. Unbalanced forces are required to create change and acceleration. And an unbalanced force must be of a different magnitude and in the opposite direction. If, if this is true, then this is a heavy lift to transform institutions founded on the premises of exclusion, elitism, and rooted in what Bell Hooks calls the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Strategic leadership and change management, then, should be designed to respond to these realities and include strategies that involve unbalanced external and non-conservative forces that have velocity and cause displacement, acceleration in order to change the status quo. Next slide, please. When I started my own journey, I didn't have the tools or the understanding. All I knew was one word: the system. That's the word my parents taught me, the system. I didn't know at the time that they were talking about a system that was designed to oppress African Americans and other people of color and just people who were different. The system, again, that Bell Hooks calls the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. I just love that phrase. That's the system. That's what Bell Hooks calls the system. But my parents made me watch Roots as a 10-year-old child. And it was the start of a lifelong journey as a young Black girl to understand that something was wrong in the world. When I finished high school at 16 and spent 2 years on the professional tennis circuit, experiencing the racist and sexist system of white tennis, my eyes started to be open even more. I had experiences, but not the tools. And I needed the tools and I needed an education. I started my journey to understand the system at the University of Iowa. A bachelor's degree in literature with a minor in philosophy and African American studies enabled me to cultivate skills of questioning and interrogating the journey of race in America. My journey continued at Vanderbilt as a law student and a PhD student in sociology. While I was seeking answers to questions, I was still experiencing profound levels of the operation of the system, of racism and sexism, the isolation, the loneliness, and the oneness. In seeking to integrate theoretically and methodologically the disciplines of law and sociology, I found a case study in Detroit. My dissertation, Where Are the Black Girls? The Marginalization of Black Girls in the Single-Sex School Debate in Detroit, formed the basis for my first book on critical race feminism and education, a social justice model. Next slide. That work was an opportunity to think critically and to write about race and gender and to critique not only white racism, white feminism, but also Black male sexism and Black nationalism. It was an opportunity for me to explore issues of race, class, gender, and nationalism in the Detroit African American community through a comprehensive and complex lens. I documented what I found, and what I found in Detroit was that the rallying cry at public marches in support of 3 all-Black male K-6 academies was, "Keep your girls at home." This rallying cry reflected the literal and symbolic perspective about the role and place of African American girls and women in society. In my search for justice, I didn't want African American girls to have to stay at home, hidden, invisible, marginalized, uneducated, and silenced. I wanted to shine light on African American women and girls. And I wanted to understand how the legal and social justice movement to create an equal number of seats for girls in the 560-seat academies resulted in only 36 girls attending. I wondered, where are the Black girls? What happened? In order to understand the outcome, I needed to develop a tool and a method of analysis. I developed a tool called the Transdisciplinary Applied Social Justice Model. Next slide, please. The Transdisciplinary Applied Social Justice Model is the application of concepts, theories, and methodologies from multiple academic disciplines to social problems with the goal of addressing injustice in society and improving the experiences of marginalized individuals and groups. Essentially, the model facilitates the processing and understanding of experiences through an equity lens, with an emphasis on understanding outcomes and possibly disrupting outcomes. The model draws from discourse analysis, Black feminist thought, critical race theory, critical race feminism, and collective action frames from Snow and Benford's social movement theory. Next slide, please. Collective action focuses on analyzing what it takes to move people from inaction to action in pursuit of a social cause. The first stage is essentially recognition, defining a condition as unjust and creating a moral imperative for action. The second stage is responsibility, assigning responsibility often to one or more structures of power. It asks the question, who or what is responsible for this unjust condition? And the third stage is recourse or rallying cry. So recognition, responsibility, and rallying cry are the building blocks of social movements. I want to focus on the second stage for a moment, who or what is responsible, and use that to incorporate sociological theory and Black feminist thought. Next slide, please. Patricia Hill Collins's concept. Oh, I think the slide is not aligned. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, thank you. Patricia Hill Collins's concept of a matrix of domination is instrumental in understanding the cause and responsibility for a particular social condition. Matrix of domination refers to the way that power is organized because it is often a structure of power that creates and perpetuates a social condition. Collins identifies four interrelated domains where power is organized. A hegemonic cultural domain where ideologies such as white supremacy, patriarchy, and heterosexism are constructed, shared, legitimized, and maintained. A structural domain where social institutions of a society, such as banks, hospitals, schools, exist as almost impenetrable social structures. A disciplinary domain where modern bureaucracies and social structures are maintained and constrained through policies, practices, procedures, rules, and laws. And an interpersonal domain where relationships between individuals influence outcomes on an everyday level of social interaction. In the context of higher education, the hegemonic domain can be seen as the mission and purpose of an institution, but even more specifically, the canon and the curriculum that is taught to students, often privileging certain texts and perspectives. Ideologies of exceptionalism, ideologies of racism, sexism, classism, perceptions about what is quality and who can be qualified. The structural domain is the bureaucratic organizational structure of departments, colleges, units, and programs. The disciplinary domain is the faculty and staff handbook, policies, requirements for tenure, requirements for admissions. And the interpersonal domain is the relationship between people in power, with perceived power, with assumed power. Deans, directors, department heads, budget, HR, IT professionals, administrative assistants. Individuals in the interpersonal domain enforce and execute the policies, practices, and procedures of the disciplinary domain within the structural domain, as influenced by the biases and prejudices they bring from the hegemonic domain. The interpersonal domain is the space in which racism, sexism, and other biases, including microaggressions, actually, I prefer the term macroaggressions, are carried out. More importantly, though, it is also a space in which acts of resistance, self-empowerment, and activism exists. These domains are sites and barriers and places of oppression, but they can also be places and sites of opportunity. So to create sustainable change within the academy, within higher education institutions, I argue that one has to be knowledgeable and aware of the domains and understand their operation, and then seek to reimagine and repurpose the domains from sites of domination and power to sites of resistance and justice. This is not easy work. It requires reimagining an institutional structure solidified on multiple levels as a matrix, because often you cannot only address one domain at a time. All the domains are impacted. These domains of power, ideologies of oppression, structures of oppression, rules of oppression, and relationships of oppression almost operate invisibly, stitched into the fabric of American society, and not just American society, but the global world, and into our minds as culture, the way things are, and we are made to believe the way things should be. Changing the system can only happen by an interrogation and understanding of power and the domains of power. Once the domains of power are understood, the third stage of social change can happen: recourse, mobilizing action and creating the impetus that moves individuals to engage in social movements. Successful social movements, which transform societies and social institutions, are able to garner support across large and diverse populations in support of a common moral and just cause. Movements are like earthquakes, shifting tectonic plates, shifts that create change. Next slide, please. Okay, go back to the former slide. The one before that. Okay, thank you. Successful social movements move people and motivate normally agnostic, ambivalent, and apathetic masses to action for a moral cause. Social movements are about our morals and our values as a nation, as a people. Movements are unbalanced forces that move society from inertia to motion, movement, acceleration, and change. I've listed social movements in America, but we can add the recent social movements around the current war in the Middle East, the current crisis in Ukraine, the current wars all over the United States, all over the world that people protest. What I learned in Detroit in particular was that the Black community defined the social problem as the Black male crisis, as well as white racism, class dynamics, and the presence of girls in the classroom. Multiple domains were impacted: hegemonic ideologies, the structural domain of schools, the disciplinary domain of policies, and the interpersonal domains of students and teachers. And so the moral platform was strong, the responsible parties were clearly identified, and they were able to garner extraordinary momentum for change with a rallying cry of "Keep your girls at home." Recognition, responsibility, recourse slash rallying cry. The case of George Floyd. The moral cause, a murder. The responsible party, police, criminal justice system. The rallying cry, I can't breathe. Similarly, the attempted coup on January 6th. Those who participated were motivated by their own understanding of justice and morality, their own understanding of responsible parties, and their own ability to mobilize. Their rallying cry, "Stop the steal," created a movement. Recognition, responsibility, recourse, and rallying cry. How do these concepts of power domains, recognition, responsibility, recourse, and rallying cry relate to sustainable institutional transformation for DEI? As I said earlier, the domains reflect both challenges and opportunities. They are sources of oppression, but also opportunities for activism. Understanding the model enables us to have tools to challenge institutional structures, ideologies, and individuals who seek to inhibit the advancement of equity. The model enables the careful consideration of a counter strategy, a counter movement, and a counter narrative to combat the power of the domains. This is, in fact, the work of social justice, of creating sustainable institutional transformation. You are trying to change society and structures, its way of doing, its way of being, its way of thinking. How do we do that? Social change, meaningful and transformational and sustainable social change can only occur through social movements which shift the ways in which power has operated. Transformational change must be able to navigate within a complex structure that is designed to maintain the status quo. An institution has to be ready, really ready for the work of change. If not, you attract the diversity you might desire, but then you can't retain it. A telling example is the resignation letter of Leslie Loco, who was the dean of the School of Architecture of the City College of New York. She was born to Scottish and Ghanaian parents, raised in Scotland and Ghana. She received her PhD in architecture from the University of London, and she founded the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg in 2015. In 2019, she was appointed to City College, serving more than 400 students in architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture. City College had been without a dean for 4 years. 9 months into her tenure, she resigned. And in her public resignation letter, she says, "My decision to leave Spitzer after less than a year is fairly straightforward. I was not able to build enough support to be able to deliver on either my promise of change or my vision of it. The reasons why are more complex. Race is never far from the surface of any situation in the United States. Having come directly from South Africa, I wasn't prepared for the way it manifests in the United States. And quite simply, I lacked the tools to both process and deflect it. The lack of respect and empathy for Black people, especially Black women, caught me off guard, although it's by no means unique to Spitzer. I suppose I'd say in the end that my resignation was a profound act of self-preservation." And she continues, she compared her experience in South Africa to the United States. Next slide, please. She said, "The changes we made in South Africa were, I believe, only possible in the context of violent student protests that occurred in 2015 and 2016. The one great achievement of the graduate school, in my view, was its ability to turn the impulse from destruction to production of knowledge, insight, and opportunity. That was the real transformation, working productively with violence, as strange as that might sound. For all sorts of valid reasons, Americans fear violence, no matter that it's all around. Yet in the short time I've been here, the level of emotional and intellectual violence inflicted on those of quote unquote difference, however it's constructed, has been both sobering and shocking. As long as we continue to resist it, the kind of transformational change we all claim to seek will require a kind of intellectual violence that no institution wants to provoke or support. I suppose the real question for all schools, again, not just Spitzer, is how far they are prepared to allow leaders to explore options for influencing the world differently with different pedagogical and operational models, different paradigms, different hierarchies, and different outcomes, which for me is the only way to achieve meaningful change. So this is her public resignation letter. I want to suggest this dean was like the little lady I mentioned at the start of the presentation. She is reminding us that we need different tools, different paradigms, and different models. I often wonder how many institutions are really ready for institutional transformation for intellectual violence. Are universities ready for the voices of courageous individuals? More importantly, how many of us are prepared to be courageous individuals? I want to share some of my thinking about courage. And I'm going to draw from my book, A Black Woman's Journey from Cotton Picking to College Professor, Lessons about Race, Class, and Gender in America. Next slide, please. This book is about my mother's journey from being a sharecropper and picking cotton in the 1930s, just one generation outside of slavery, enslavement. Her grandmother, in fact, my mother's grandmother was in fact enslaved. So this book is about my mother's journey growing up in 1930s in rural Texas during the Great Depression to becoming a college professor. She became a tenured full professor in the 1970s when less than 1% of Black women were full professors. Going from the cotton fields to the academic fields, her life is a story of challenging the status quo at every stage of her life journey. I'm just going to share one key example. In 1972, she was an assistant professor and she was going up for tenure. And there was some shenanigans happening. And so she decided she was going to write a letter to the president of the university, chastising him and calling out the racism of the institution about her tenure case. In her letter to the president, she says, "Mr. President, I have found myself since early April caught up in an entanglement regarding my department's recommendation that I be appointed to the position of associate professor. As I have been struggling through the maze of what you describe as inefficiency, my intellectual struggle to understand led me to conceptualize the situation as institutional racism. Now, Mr. President, I'm not a lawyer, but like most Black people in this sea of white, I've had to learn with my fellow brothers and sisters that life in America is a constant diet of struggle for justice. Being competent is not a passport in this white sea, but a symbol for stand back further. Because a competent Black person threatens the secure feeling of the racist in his myth that all Blacks are inferior. In simple language, I have been compelled to assert it is impossible for a Black person to get justice at this university. I have then decided that the appointment process in this university community is filled with deliberately built-in stumbling blocks. Let me provide a brief summary of some of the many inconsistencies which I have encountered. Since you have the final decision-making responsibility here on campus, I am placing the facts in your hands. I refuse to be insulted. What happened here? A Black woman in 1972 wrote a letter to the president of the university about her tenure case saying, "No, not cool, stop the racism, I refuse to be insulted." There was no movement, no hashtag, no Me Too, just a woman of one, trying to change the way the story ends. Next slide, please. How often do we as women, as people of color, as white people, speak up? Speak to our supervisor, to the dean, the vice president, to the department head, to tenured faculty, to the person who has said a racist, sexist, or homophobic comment in a meeting. When do we speak to those in authority, with power over us, with decision-making responsibility? We don't need permission to do it, for permission will never be given. If we wait, it will never come. How often do we call out, as Mildred referred to them, deliberately built-in stumbling blocks? And not only call out, but actually work to remove them. This is, in fact, the work of social justice and equity, removing the barriers with our own voice, not only for ourselves, but also for others. We need to often ask ourselves, are we at a table that normally we shouldn't be? Have we been positioned with power to speak up on behalf of the powerless, the absent? We must ask, why are we in the room? Why do we have this degree? Why are we educated? What is our purpose? For surely it cannot be to remain silent when there is so much injustice and so much that deserves a voice. And though it often starts with one courageous voice, it usually can build many. So we have to be disruptive. We must realize that we are working within a system not designed to support the vulnerable, the poor, the people of color, the different. The question is, what are we willing to do for them? Do we know what to do? I believe we must begin to use words as our power. Great leaders like Martin Luther King, Fannie Lou Hamer, or others during the Civil Rights Movement used their words to challenge the moral conscience of America and to motivate and move stagnant and scared Black and white Americans to engage in nonviolent protest with words. Each of us has words, and the choice is ours, for the words are ours. We get the choice of when we use it and how we use our words, how we use our voice. The question for each of us is, what will we do with our voice, with our power, with our positions of influence, with our words? Will we use it to disrupt the status quo to create a more equitable and just society? Each of us at some point may have power. And the question is, how will we use it? When will we use it? And who will we use it to help? What most often empowers us to use our voice and our power is a certain spirit and mindset. For me, it was anger. It is anger. As a younger college student, I had a wild, undirected passion, an anger, a rage, a deep pain caused by the mere experience of being a Black woman in America. It was a righteous indignation at the world, at life, and the unfairness of it all. I often think if others and if more of us became more angry with a rage, society would perhaps change faster. Rage and anger are powerful energies, and energy that can be channeled for justice. I believe that all great leaders have deep rage, simmered and filtered through different lenses, guides, and boundaries so that it can be channeled effectively for good. Audre Lorde reminds us that anger is loaded with information and energy and can be translated into action and service. I recently posted on LinkedIn about my reflections while reading essays by Audre Lorde, and I found her writing to be tremendously inspirational. What I have learned in my work is that social change, meaningful transformation, and sustainable change can only occur through social movements and only can occur by speaking up. And education can perhaps give us the words. And we, those of us who care, allies, advocates, activists, sometimes as individuals of one, sometimes as one voice, collective voice, have to publicly, sometimes privately, but always courageously, relentlessly, persistently, and unyieldingly commit to using our voice to transform the world. And this is our research. The system understands the power of voice, for words have energy and power. The world and universities seek to silence dissenters and to limit free speech, freedom of the press. This hegemonic world in which we live has socialized silence. I think how often women, people of color, advocates, allies are silent, unable, or unwilling to speak. Someone once said, "There are still some times when I am silent." A professor once said, "There are still some times when I am silent." Most often because I am afraid. Sometimes justifiably, sometimes not. Yet usually I do not achieve anything as a result of my silence. Silence does not cause the fear to disappear. Silence does not make me feel more secure. Silence does not dispel the ignorance. When I posted about Audre Lorde, I said, oh, we always say, become more courageous. But I think it's important that we have to learn to act even while we are in fear, that we have to act even while we feel threatened and vulnerable. I believe that we must refuse to be silent and silenced. Fighting against the silence is a means of survival and also a radical act of courage, because the perilousness of our existence as marginalized people, as women on the current state of the earth, on the planet, demands that we continue to speak, to voice our concerns, and to become more courageous. We speak through our research in the academy, and we share our research and our words and our thoughts, not only in books and journals, but social media is another important platform to share our voice. In the past 9 years, I've been trying to use social media to share my words on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and through a blog on my own website on a range of topics. Because if not us, then who? Social media allows us to have our own agency, to connect to a world of other scholars, to not be dependent on journals and editors and publishing companies, to get our words and thoughts out into the world. We have to transform silence into language and action. This is research. If we are silent because we strangle and swallow our words, we can suffocate ourselves with silent lives. Knowing that death is the final silence, we have to realize that silence will not protect us or even protect others. So how do we find and use our voice? We have to find the tool and vehicle that can facilitate a space and place for our voice. I spent my life, most of my life, trying to find that voice within, and then to be courageous enough to share that voice. It takes courage, and what I have learned is that you can't wait to have courage before you act. You have to act while you are afraid, scared, and timid. That's what I learned in my most recent book, Blackwildgirl, a writer's journey to take back her superpower. This book is based on 45 years of journals that I have been writing since I was 8 years old. In those journals was wisdom, knowledge, information, and guidance. It had to be unearthed and discovered. Next slide, please. I want to share a short excerpt from my book. It's a journal entry that I wrote on August 18th, 2019. And I wrote about the challenge of being a Black woman scholar activist. And I just want to emphasize that when I was writing these journals, I wasn't expecting to share them, but realized that as sort of an act of courage, I needed to share my thinking. So on August 19th, kind of to myself, I wrote this journal entry. 2 days ago, I was in despair. I didn't think I could write this book about my life. I was tired of fighting invisible ghosts of racism, sexism, and hatred. I was tired of the energy of those who are jealous, of those who are dismissive, and those who make me question everything. I cried and cried and cried. I called upon the God I believe in to rescue me, to save me from what I don't even know then or now. Maybe it was just the sinking feeling of my constant struggle. I woke up in the morning surprised I fell asleep. I must have cried myself to sleep. I look at the outline for this book. It's rough. I'm struggling to write about my life as a Black woman, for our lives are not singular lives, but intertwined with others. Our stories are part of their stories, and their stories are part of ours. In telling the intertwined stories, I've been experiencing an internal battle about what to share, what to reveal, and what to allow to remain hidden. My brother Awadajan, an internationally renowned classical pianist, conductor, and full professor of music, reminds me that sanitizing protects no one, and that something has to explain how we got to where we are in the world. In working on this manuscript, I've been asking myself questions. What do I say? What do I omit? How do I not harm? How can I be authentic and honest? What will people think? What do I share about myself? How much of myself do I share? Do I actually share how much I weigh and that I've been fighting my weight for decades, not quite willing or able to accept that perhaps this is where it is and what it will be? Do I share my financial struggle of always worrying about money, of never having enough, of living paycheck to paycheck, of being a primary breadwinner or the sole breadwinner, and of living with credit card debt with interest at 27%? Do I share about all the times I wrote to my supervisors begging them to pay me what I knew others were paid with less education, less time in the office than me? Do I write about the times I've cried and cried from the racism and sexism and meanness in the world? How do I write about the lonely journey of being a young, gifted, and Black girl in the world? How do I share how hard it was and is to be a Black woman scholar activist? The only way for me to share how hard it was and is was to create my own tool. Next slide, please. I've coined the concept of Black womanist theometasis, an integration of theory, method, and praxis to reflect the complexity of the tool needed to do battle with the hegemony in the academy that constantly requires bifurcation, categorization, and binaryism. Rather than conceptualizing theory and method as separate and binary and seeing praxis as distinct from theory and method, theometasis recognizes the power of integration to provide a holistic approach that defies categorization. I use the phrase Black womanist because it includes elements of both girlhood and womanhood and spirituality. A Black womanist theometasis framework as part of a Black feminist womanist research praxis paradigm uses Black women's autobiography, critical praxis, autoethnography, counter storytelling, and Black girl cartography as methodological tools. It draws from cultural studies, feminist theories, African American history, women's history, and childhood studies, and integrates theoretical constructs from Black feminist thought, Black girlhood studies, critical Black feminism, hip hop feminism, crunk feminism, new Black feminism, womanist thought, womanist theology, and the wild woman archetype. The praxis is a political act of writing ourselves into the text, into the world, into history, into creation. A Black womanist theomistast facilitated the organization and analysis for Blackwildgirl. Blackwildgirl draws from 45 years of personal journals with letters and poems, and it's an initiation journey to tell the story of Black girlhood to Black womanhood in America. It's shared as a 4-act performance praxis with 12 stages with scenes, almost like a performance, because we are, in fact, the main character in our lives, and our lives unfold on public and private stages. The book is the praxis of this theory. To find a press, I had to dissect the academic component from its application and praxis. So the journal article is the tool, and the book is an example of the execution of the tool. As I close, I want to share just a few lessons I learned in my journey. These lessons are also influenced by the American Council on Education Leadership Program that I just completed. As part of that program, I visited Ethiopia, Benin, Senegal, Uganda, South Africa, and India, and I've been reflecting on those experiences. Lesson 1, next slide, please. Discipline and a commitment to excellence are important tools. My parents gave me 2 survival tools, discipline and a commitment to excellence. As I wrote in the book, discipline and excellence were a virtue and value to help me as a young Black woman persevere, no matter what. In spite of all obstacles, in spite of any challenges, discipline and excellence were my guides. They would be my guideposts to ensure that my feet remained on the straight and narrow road of life. Discipline and excellence would ensure persistence, resilience, and endurance. They were hard driving forces pushing me forward against all and any odds. Excellence required setting almost unachievable goals, and discipline helped me achieve them. My grandmother's values influenced my journey. My mother's mother only had a 6th grade education. As I said earlier, her grandmother had been enslaved. Her mother had been enslaved. But she loved poetry. And when I was young, she wrote me a letter that included these lines from a poem. In my June 6, 1982 journal, I wrote, "Poem from Grandma Searles. The heights that great men reached and kept were not obtained by sudden flight, but those while their companions slept were toiling upwards through the night." I thought that she had written the poem, but it was only a few years ago that I actually learned that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote the poem in 1880. So, excellence and discipline have informed my journey, but there's a cost to this approach, and that's the second lesson. Next slide, please. There's a lot of loneliness in the pursuit of excellence. And to be young, gifted, and Black, Lorraine Hansberry writes, "The thing that makes you exceptional, if you are at all, is eventually that which must also make you lonely." She wrote of the pain and perhaps shame of being lonely and alone at her typewriter in her journal entry on the Saturday evening before Easter in 1962. Like Lorraine, on August 16th, 2019, I wrote in my own journal, "I felt very lonely just now and today. Yet, I am committed to the almost indescribably lonely path of a Black scholar. It is indeed a lonely road and a precarious journey to be a Black woman scholar activist with a commitment to being revolutionary." Next slide, please. Lesson 3. Being revolutionary requires telling your story. I published a new book maybe a few weeks ago. It came out. It's called Dear Higher Education, Letters from the Social Justice Mountain. It's been an amazing collaboration with my colleague at Virginia Tech, Michelle DeRamo, and a colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota, the Chief Diversity Officer, Mercedes Ramirez Fernandez. This book contains 23 letters from practitioners and scholars globally. And you can find the book on the University of Minnesota Library. It's an open access digital platform. This is a unique platform for publication, and I'm thrilled to have discovered this platform for publishing. It allowed us to circumvent the often 18 to 24 timeline for traditional book publishing. It enables open free access online on a digital platform. And it enables us to continue to solicit and add letters to this project. And we will be soliciting more letters. And if you go to the website to the book, you can find a form where you can share your interest in sharing your own letter to higher education. This work is actually one of the highlights of my career. It was so controversial that a close colleague in Florida was discouraged from contributing to the book by her provost and legal counsel. The impetus was the book was the anti-DEI movement and the complete erasure of DEI efforts and silencing of those voices. And I wanted to create a platform and a space for those voices to be heard. But it ended up becoming global. And so women from India and South Africa and New Zealand, Australia have also begun contributing to the project. So I hope many of you will think about contributing as well. And that brings me to my next lesson. Next slide, please. It's so important to get your words out into the world. Bell Hooks said, "No Black woman writer in this culture can write too much. Indeed, no woman writer has ever written enough." And we can leverage social media to get your words out. And it's a power that you can control, as I shared earlier. My point is that your words are valuable, and it's important to figure out how to put your words out into the world. Next slide, please. Lesson 5. It's time for women warriors and righteous brothers. I have been struck, as I have for many years, by the overwhelming dominant presence of male voices in all walks of life. Men on the news, men talking about the conflict, men talking about religion, men talking about politics, men talking about education, men in government spaces, men in corporate spaces, men in military spaces, men in education spaces. In Uganda, the director of a refugee camp that I was honored and privileged to visit said that men start wars because they want power, but women and children suffer because women represented 80% of those in the refugee camp. We have to find a way to interject the voices of women into conversations. We need to interrupt, to shout out, to be rude. Women need to be rude. We cannot hold our hand up and wait to be called upon. We need the voices of mothers, of women who knows what it means to carry babies on their back, to carry loads on their heads, to nurse babies while working, to withstand the pain of childbirth, women who cook, clean, work, and love. I'm not male bashing or putting down men and fathers. I'm just talking about the power and the important presence of women and the reality that society wants, and it has often put women in a box in the home with psychological, emotional, physical, and spiritual barriers that have symbolically and literally imprisoned their voices and spirits, and ultimately power and influence. In Benin, I was privileged to see this statue that you see in this PowerPoint of Queen Tassie Hingbi of the Dahomey dynasty. The statue symbolizes the leader of an all-female military corps that inspired woman king. In the statue, she has a gun and a sword. We need women who lead armies, metaphorically, with swords and guns and a savvy and sophistication based on their lived experiences, navigating jobs, children, men, and community, because patriarchy is alive and well. It's a powerful force orchestrating and impacting the experiences of women in many countries. It's time for women warriors and righteous brothers. In Uganda, I heard that term, righteous brothers. These are men who understand, support, respect, and affirm the power, role, and intelligence and necessity of women in leadership roles. These are men like the Deputy Vice Chancellor in Uganda who said, women do a better job than men. They pay attention to detail and they often mother an institution. I was in Uganda as part of HERS East Africa, and HERS is an amazing organization. There's a HERS in the United States, Higher Education Resource Services, that supports the advancement of women in higher ed. There's a HERS South Africa and the HERS East Africa. And I was privileged this year to become part and to be part of those amazing organizations. Next slide, please. There is wisdom within you. Learn to connect with it, honor it, and be obedient to it. Transcribing 45 years of journals revealed my wisdom to myself, the tools that were waiting to be unearthed. But each of you, each of us at this stage of our lives has a superpower, a talent that has gotten us this far. We just have to figure out how to honor it, to cherish it, to respect it, and to use it for its higher good. This is your superpower, your metaphorical black wild girl. And the question is, what's her name? And can we go seek, look, and find her? So this can be our legacy, and this can be how we transform the world with our words and our voice. We have to write our own story. No one will write it for us. And we have to discover our own inner wisdom, power, and purpose, and celebrate ourselves. And so I want to close with a final word of advice from a quote in Women Who Run with Wolves from Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And I have to say that this book was really a shift for me in writing Black Wild Girl when I realized that I could structure my life based on an Indigenous story called The Handless Maiden in that book. And I could structure my life as 12 initiation stages based on the stages of The Handless Maiden. And so in that book, there's a quote: "Do not cringe or feel small if you are called a black sheep, a maverick, the lone wolf. Those with slow seeing say that a nonconformist is a blight on society. But it has been proven over centuries that being different means standing at the edge, means that one is practically guaranteed to make an original contribution, a useful and stunning contribution to her culture. If you have ever been called defiant, incorrigible, forward, cunning, insurgent, unruly, or rebellious, you're on the right track." Next slide. I just want to thank you for the honor and privilege of joining and having this conversation. These are ways that you can connect with me. On my website, Menah Pratt, there's also a blackwildgirl.com website, and I'm on social media. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Menah. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I feel like I am learning more and more and more every single time I hear from you. We have so many questions, so I hope you are ready to go. And I've looked through these; they are really good questions. So I'm excited about all the wisdom you're gonna share. All right. So the first question is, do you have suggestions on what to do as a Black woman when I know they are not ready, but they say that they are ready? One, as a PhD student, and two, as an employee of the same institution. So this woman asking is a PhD student and employee. So you understand that, right? When they say they are ready, but I know they are not ready. Do you have any advice?
Yes, I mean, I think you have to decide is can you make a difference at that institution? So within your sphere of influence, even if the institution, because that's a large body of people, is not ready, is the department, is the program, is the college, like, are there other allies that actually might be ready? So I think the institution as a whole, I don't think the institution as a whole is ever ready, but there might be people who are ready, and allies and advocates and other activists that you can find that can work with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's another one. I'm hopefully I think we can get through all of these. So, how does one become a courageous individual in this space without allowing ignorant individuals to get under our skin and take us off focus? This is a really good question, and I know this is something that you can speak to.
Yes, I mean, it sort of goes back to that. What is your own focus? And how do you remain committed? What reminders do you need to have? When I was writing Blackwildgirl, I had Nikki Giovanni up on my wall of inspiration. I had Maya Angelou, I had Lorraine Hansberry, I had Leonida McLean. I mean, just as like reminders, like why am I doing this work? Why am I here? And if those reminders are strong enough, it blocks out the distraction. So I think the clarity of and you don't have to engage with the distraction. Like it could just become, white noise because your own clarity of focus is so strong. So I think it's just important to remember, like, what are you here for? What are you trying to do? And try to block out those distractions.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's another one. Combating imposter syndrome is an ongoing conversation. So how can we produce and share our work and our voice with others without getting in our heads about it?
I think you just have to be in your head about it. You might not get out of your head. And I think that's okay. I think you just have to, while you're in your head, and while you still have those anxious feelings like I don't belong, I'm not good enough, what I say doesn't matter, it's still just put it out there. I mean, and you might think that it's imperfect. I don't remember thinking and now chairing dissertation committees, it's like, oh, I don't feel like this is good enough. It's like, girl, dude, you know your dissertation better than anybody. Like you've been in those work, you've been in the lit review, you've been in the data, you know it. And I think that reminder to just affirm yourself, like, girl, you got this. Hey, I got this. I can do it. There's no shame in like affirming yourself. And you just have to remind yourself, I got it. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do it while I mean, I saw this bumper sticker that said, speak your mind, even if your voice shakes. So just because and I've been in meetings, I mean, I'm a tenured full professor. My voice should not be shaking at this point in my life, but sometimes it does. I'm like, oh man, why is my voice sounding like that? But I still have to say what I feel like I have to say. So I think you've got to just push through that like psychological barrier.
Thank you for saying that, and I also just want to co-sign that, often my voice shakes too, and I find it to be really embarrassing, but it just happens, and most people would think there's no way that that could happen, but it definitely happens, and so I appreciate you saying that, and I also appreciate you talking about just affirming yourself. And but we were at dinner last night, and one of the things I had talked about was that there are often times where I'm home alone and I say, "You got this. You can do it. Just keep on. Come on, keep moving forward." So you gotta do that. All right, here's one. Can you speak to the challenges of building multiracial coalitions when there is persistent pressure against solidarity based on racial or class-based autonomy?
Yeah. I think it starts with that. It's just like understanding the power of that interpersonal domain. And it is people all the time that make change. And there is tremendous, I mean, research has showed this, but just I think we know in our relationships, there's actually tremendous power in in communicating across difference and having difference, different voices, different backgrounds in a room for conversation. And I think understanding what are the forces, like how are the forces sort of manifesting in this coalition that you're trying to build, and understanding what your strategy is going to be to address those. But I think the more clarity you have, like why did we come together, what work of justice are we trying to do, and how can we do it? And sometimes those oppositional voices are actually good, because then you know what people are thinking and what the challenge and what the oppression is that you're really trying to fight against. So you don't want to completely silence that or box it out. But I think understanding it, it's like, okay, that these people are upset for these reasons. And sometimes you like can engage it. Can we have a conversation about what you think? I mean, I feel like we've sort of gotten away from conversations, but I think it's really important to just like tell me what you think and why. And I might disagree and you might disagree with me, but at least we had the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's a really important one. As a Black woman, how do you manage your mental health and prioritize self-care in this space or just on a day-to-day basis?
Okay. So I believe in counseling. I've gone to counseling most of my life. I mean, sometimes I've had great ones. Sometimes the counselor I was talking to, I thought, well, you need to be in counseling. Maybe you are, but so I think, it takes time to find the right counselor. And sometimes, yes, it can be a counselor that's also a Black woman, but I have found counselors who are not always identified with my own gender and race identity are often better and can have a different perspective and sort of push and challenge me in different ways. And it's not as if, all counseling sessions are, complicated. Sometimes it's like, hey, I'm celebrating this interesting, exciting thing in my life. And it's just like you have a cheerleader sometimes. Sometimes they push you in different ways. So I just think that weekly, depending on what stage you are in your life, that's really an important thing. But I think that then daily, you have to decide what your practices are. Like I'm a deeply spiritual person. So I've gotten up early all my life. I try to write, I try to journal, I try to find that quiet space and peace within. And it's like daily work because, as I said earlier, I have sort of this anger at the injustice in the world that I carry. And it's not like helpful to carry around anger all the time. So I try to find like the joy. So I feel like, but I say this, you have to, let me just speak for myself. I fight for my joy. I try to intentionally be like, okay, what will bring me joy? What will bring me peace? Let me go and do the thing. Let me get myself out and walk in nature. Let me call a girlfriend. Let me do this thing. So it's not like joy just shows up every morning and you're like, yay for the day. Like, I feel like you got to fight for it and claim it and own that spirit that you want to generate for the day and to be for the day.
Thank you for that. And I also just appreciate you talking about having a counselor. I also have a counselor. It's one of the best things that I've ever done in my life. I just appreciate people talking about that publicly so that people don't feel that it's not something for them. Okay, here is another one. On the topic of acting while we are afraid, what are your recommendations for self-advocacy and advocating for diverse others using the power we do have when we feel unprotected or unsupported by the systems or structures in which we are operating?
Yes. Um, Not all the time can you speak up on everything. So I feel like sometimes you have to sort of gauge and understand the dynamics in a room, in a space, and the politics of a situation. It may be speaking up in the meeting. In a meeting, you might have to say, and this is my phrase, I feel some kind of way right now. So you just sort of interrupt some dynamic in a room. Sometimes it's a conversation with a person where you can really say, I just feel like we're not treating Jane the right way. And I just feel like I needed to share that with you. Like, I really feel that we're not being fair to her, to them. So I think and it takes experience, like now I've been doing this work for a long time and I can sort of read the room a little bit better. It was really hard reading Zoom rooms. That was really hard. I can tell what was happening because, we communicate with our body. Our body is like 80% of communication. And so understanding the dynamics and the politics and finding maybe one or so trusted folks to say, hey, what do you think? And because the culture of every institution is different, every department is different, every college, every office space. And it's like, what's the culture here? And is this fight going to be worth it for me to make a difference for this person's life or career? And sometimes it might be like, girlfriend, you've got to go. Like, this is not the place where your light is gonna shine. Your star is not gonna be bright here. So let's figure out how you transition to another place where your light can shine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Here's one. How would you advise a younger person trying to make their way in the world and in their job about using their voices and bravery when a very real outcome is job loss and financial insecurity? Is it easier and more advisable to lead in this regard once a person has at least enough to survive and protect their loved ones? What a great question, right?
Yeah, it is. It's dicey. It's dicey. I mean, none of these questions have like easy answers. So I founded a conference 13 years ago called the Faculty Women of Color in the Academy National Conference. And it brings together women of color in higher ed every year to connect, support, and empower. And one year, there was a woman who said, for 7 years, I never spoke, an assistant professor. I never spoke. I just kept my head down. I just did my work. I didn't pay attention to things, politics, didn't like anything distract me. I never spoke. And then I got tenure. And everybody else who got tenure got rewarded with big offices. And when she got tenure, they just put her in like a closet. And she began to speak. So she went to a department. This is her story. She went to the department, and for like hours, she spoke. And they were like, well, we haven't been saying anything. She's like, I didn't feel like I could. And she said in the meeting, in the conference, she said, I wish I had spoken. And so again, risking your life. I mean, that's what happened in the civil rights movement, right? I mean, so this concept of social movements is very real. People come together. The Montgomery bus boycott. It's like people lost their jobs by participating in that. And so I understand there's a very real consequence. And I think you have to choose. And I think it's okay to say, this time I'm choosing self-preservation. Like I would love to help others, but I can't jeopardize my own situation and not be able to be empowering others, because all of a sudden that advocacy has caused your own life situation to be precarious. But it doesn't mean that. I think we operate so much, it's like it's either this or that. But there could be a little delicate middle. I mean, that's what law teaches me. Like I'm always trying to look for the gray. So it doesn't have to be like, okay, if you don't do so and so for my friend, I'm out of here. It's like, can we just talk about this a little bit? So I think there's small ways that you can still feel like you're advocating or you're raising an issue, you're having voice without jeopardizing your own livelihood.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's another one. First of all, a big thank you. And then what self-care techniques have you leveraged for your own self-preservation to preclude quiet quitting and learned hopelessness? And what role should those of the dominant identity embody and internalize to help lift the necessity for change burden? So I'm not sure if that was completely clear. I tried to read it as I can.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's okay sort of to quiet quit sometimes. As you prepare for what's next, you might need to dial back your, 100%, 110% engagement. And women tend to give, people of color, we were like invested. And I remember when I was at University of Illinois, I was like going in early. I was leaving late. My car was the last one to leave the parking lot. I was the last person to turn off the lights. I mean, I was invested in this change. And one day I heard this voice say, Simon says, take 2 steps backwards. I was like, what? And it was a very real sort of message. It's like, step back. And when 2 Black women presidents died last year about this time, Temple University and a community a college in Tennessee. And a Black woman died by suicide in January, and Black women presidents had to step down. It's like, hold up, hold up. We need to be less invested, more invested in ourselves, because no one can exercise for me. Like I'd love to charge, some AI person to like do exercise for me, but it's like, it'll be possible. Like I got to exercise myself. So I have to like that discipline of, okay, I matter. My body matters. My health matters. Let me try not to eat these fries. Like, okay, let me do the salad. I was really pleased with myself. I ate a salad last night. So it's like these choices that we can control. And I think we have to remember what our own autonomy is, our own agency. And to do, it's like, okay to leave work early. It's like, just step out. Like I remember when I was working at the law firm, I realized that I could go out this back door and go down like steps to the elevator and just sort of disappear. And sometimes like you just need to step away for your own sanity. So you don't have the nervous breakdown at work. You're not, just anxious and unsettled. Like sometimes you step away and you come back. And I guess I would say, as I shared earlier, that I used to come home and I would be upset with somebody at work. It's like, John, I'm so mad at John. And I would come into my home. I would tell my kids about John. I would call my best girlfriend up. I would tell her about John, like day one. The next day I'd come back. I'd tell her about John again. The third day, we were always talking about John. And one day, I don't know how, it just sort of came to me. And it's like, John is in my house. Like I brought John from my work into my quiet, peaceful space. And so now, like I get home and I deliberately say, John, you're just staying outside the door. Like I'm not bringing you in. I'm not talking about you. I'm not giving you, because I'm sure John's not thinking about me. He's just like moved on with his life. So I recommend that, like this intentionality, whatever that thing is. It's like, look, you're staying outside. Like I'm not going to give you energy. I'm not going to pay attention to you. I'm moving on. Now I might have to go to work the next day and still deal with John. He's still there, but I'm not constantly living about John. He's not occupying my whole space.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. We have time for more. So, do you or will you have a mentorship program to develop righteous women?
Righteous women.
Yes.
I guess I could think about that. I mean, I think the Faculty Women of Color in the Academy Conference is a space that I've tried to create that thinks about the academy, the higher ed environment, thinks about the need to support women, um, those who identify as women. It's for graduate students, it's for faculty, it's for administrators. So it's a space that I think is flexible enough to accommodate a variety of needs. I mean, we got like 150 some workshop proposals. We just closed the proposal process, but there are like amazing speakers that are part of that conference and amazing workshops that happen. And so I'm hoping that there will be, and there have been over the 13 years, presentations that sort of address a variety of these issues, like leadership, speaking out, self-care, mentorship. So I think it's a space of a lot of shared wisdom. And so I would encourage you to think about the registration's open. It opened a few days ago, but it's Faculty Women of Color in the Academy National Conference.
Great, great. Here's another question about advice. Do you have advice for selecting mentors?
Oh, yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. And I don't feel like I've had actually many mentors in my life, actually, but I've had people who have been helpful in particular moments. Because sometimes we want the mentor to be like our best friend, like our go-to guru. And I
Mhm.
don't know that they can always be that for the span of a career. But if you have like some targeted advice, a targeted need, a specific need, like I just need to talk to somebody about X, Y, and Z issues, and you can narrow it down. And then think about folks you've interacted with, you've seen maybe at conferences that you at least connect. It's hard to reach out to a stranger and say, hey, be my mentor. But if you've had some connection with them and you can reach out on LinkedIn, for example, and just say, hey, I've listened to you or heard you. I just have one quick question. I need a little bit of guidance on this. Do you have some time? And you might be surprised at how many people are willing to do that. Or, and if they're not, then move on, but there are people out there who will invest time and are committed to investing in the success of others. But I think it's important to clarify, like, what's your real need? It can't be my guru, be my partner for life. It's like, what is your need in this particular moment? And what advice do you need?
Right. And we have mentors for different things, right? Yeah, across the board. I always recommend people have sort of a board of mentors if they can get them in life. Okay, here's one. I would love to know how you would guide the young Black girl to use her voice in a predominantly white private school without being rude when she recognizes and feels the injustices in the educational environment.
Without being rude. Maybe she needs to be rude. I would sort of interrogate like the rude, like what does rude mean? But I think that we might perceive something as rude, but maybe it's just speaking up. It's like, I'd like to share a perspective that I have, and I recognize I'm sharing this perspective as a Black woman, but I'm the only Black woman in this space. And I think my perspective is unique. What I have found is that the brilliance of words is sometimes the more words you use, the better you're able to communicate. So if you come right out and say, I'm angry about war, people are going to be like, that energy is a little off-putting. But if you say, I've been reflecting about the injustice in society and how guns and weapons are used and cause destruction in people's lives, and they have to evacuate their home, and it creates refugees and women, and that really concerns me. People will be like, oh, let's talk about that. So I do think like how you come across and say a thing makes a huge difference. And so I've over the course of my career, right? I've tried to get better about using a few more words to say a thing than to just come right out and be like blunt about a thing. People don't respond to blunt. It kind of startles people, but
Mhm.
the gentle thing, like a flowing river, people might grasp a word or a concept that they can support you.
That's good advice. Thank you for that. Probably good advice in professional and personal
Yeah.
interactions. So, okay, here's another one. There's more coming in here, but how do you build a movement when allies are not courageous enough? How do you convince other faculty to understand that movement building and activism are necessary for change and self-preservation? I'm thinking about this in the real context of Texas's anti-DEI policies in higher ed.
I just honestly, some of these states and their legislation, it's very hard. I mean, and I think about social movements in the context of American society in higher ed have been led, unfortunately, by students. So if a group of students, many students, came across identities, came together to say, we need X, Y, and Z back. We need our space back. We need this back. Because colleges, I mean, and it's sort of odd in this moment where colleges are kind of silencing and shutting down protests and movements, but universities don't like to be confronted by angry students. They don't like the publicity associated with it, and they tend to, like, okay, what do we African American studies programs were created in the 60s by social justice movement by students. Black cultural centers were created by Latino studies programs, Asian studies.
Mhm,
I mean, a lot of ethnic studies programs, cultural centers were created by social movements by students.
mhm.
And it's not fair necessarily to say, oh, we need students to do that, but that's where the power is. And, faculty, and I remember doing this at an institution, I would like have quiet conversations with students like, this is how you need to conduct your protest. This is how you need to raise the issue to administration. I mean, I was administration, but I was counseling them on how to engage in effective advocacy. So I think it's hard sometimes for faculty. And um, but I mean, so that's why faculty do votes of no confidence. It's like we all
Mhm,
came together and we don't like you as our leader. So we're gonna, okay, that communicates something. But
mhm.
it's difficult. I mean, nothing related to this work of change in higher ed is easy.
Thank you, thank you. Here's another one. I've heard a lot, you have to about how you have to pick your battles to protect your own peace, but I feel like a bad advocate when I let things slide. How do you know what to let go of and what to fight for?
Yeah, you don't until you develop like you've been in spaces long enough. And it's hard to like get wisdom when you don't have it yet. And so then sometimes you're learning by the unfortunate experience of speaking out and you shouldn't have, or wishing that you had said something in a meeting and you could have. And I don't think you ever quite get it right.
Mhm,
Um, but I still go back to the power of the more words. Just in a meeting where people have said something and it's like, I feel some kind of way. I just feel a little uneasy about how we were talking about this issue. And that's all I wanted to say. Like, even if that's all you say, is like, this conversation has made me feel uneasy and I just want to place that into this conversation. And there's probably other people who also feel uneasy, and maybe they might say, yeah, I
mhm,
feel a little uneasy too. Like the little shenanigans we were watching here, maybe, they might not call it shenanigans and that kind of thing, but if you just say, I'm feeling a little uneasy or I feel some kind of way right now, that's all I want to say. that then you feel like you can walk out of that room. It's like, at least I said something, you know? And over time, you will get to the point where in that room, you will say, this shenanigans that I'm listening to and watching is like unacceptable. You will get to that point. Now you have to have maybe a certain level of power and status and that kind of thing, but
Thank you. Thank you. Just a couple more. We've got a few more minutes. So here's one. I love your stories. I relate to all the types of discrimination you referred to, and I understand your pain. And as a Hispanic, it is even more challenging sometimes. What is the reason for having to fight these challenges on top of those dealing with language and origin discrimination?
yeah. I felt that with my father. So my father had a very heavy accent, born in Freetown, Sierra Leone, like the accent never left. And he never became an American citizen. So he remained a citizen of Freetown, Sierra Leone. And I really feel that his life was impacted by the accent, by his natural origin. And I think those are hard things to change. And perceptions about intellect, perceptions about, qualification just because of the accent is a really strong bias that we don't often talk about. But I understand that. And I think we just have to continue to persist. And I do think that the barrier it's a different, this deliberately built-in stumbling blocks that my mother referred to in her letter. I do think that that barrier is very much there. And it doesn't mean that you can't be successful. It just means that now that you understand that that's an unfortunate barrier, like I can't change my race or my gender or, how I identify. So we understand that context, but we have to persist even in the midst of that.
So this is going to be the last question, and I think it's a good one. How do you maintain your hope that being a warrior matters to making institutions more humane?
I do have hope. I mean, but I fight for my joy. I fight to maintain hope. Like I'm very careful about what I read. I'm careful about what I watch.
Mm.
I'm careful about what I think about. I'm careful what comes into my space. Because if you allow all the things to come, it's justifiable to be uh, full of like to have no hope. Like that's the logical conclusion to whatever you read, see, think, whatever exists in the current world. The war, the climate change, the tornadoes, the earthquakes, the hurricanes, all of that to feel hopeless is justified. So if we're not going to feel hopeless and we still know those things are going on, how do we structure our lives to be focused and know that our words, our actions, and we're not trying to change the world, but we're trying to impact the people with whom we come in contact. So I think that perspective is important in your little circle, and we all have these little circles. How can we still make a difference? And so, yeah, I think it's vitally important to still have hope. And you might go through days of hopelessness, and that's cool. That's acceptable and fine. You can be hopeless for a couple of days, but then you got to get yourself back up again, pick yourself back up, and it's like, girl, find the joy, find the hope, like get back in the ring. And I think about ancestors who were like picking cotton for centuries that could have really been like, there's no hope here, generation after generation. And the tide turned unexpectedly. That yes, there was a war and it wasn't easy and all of that, but things change, sometimes slowly, not easily, not without effort and conflict. But I think there's always a reason to have some shimmer, a little bit of hope.
I really appreciate you saying, making the comment about like not letting all that negativity into your life. And, one of the things that I often will tell people is if you catch yourself doom scrolling through social media, just stop. If if you find yourself reading things that are really upsetting and you're just sort of obsessing about it every day, just stop. Try to stop yourself. And I appreciate you saying that because we don't have to let all of that negativity, right? You can't avoid everything, but I appreciate you saying that. And First of all, I wanna say thank you so much, Menna. This has been absolutely fantastic. The talk was fantastic. And we're so honored to have you as the distinguished proctor lecturer. And I also wanna say thank you to the audience. Great questions. We couldn't even answer all of them, which means that they were thoroughly engaged. And your message, you're a fierce person, you're a hopeful person. I think you're a very humane person who gives people grace, and I really appreciate that about you. Thank you for all the work that you do, and I'm sure people will be interested in taking a look at your new books and all of the great work that you're doing. So, thank you. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.